All right, team. Let's get right into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Building on our foundation, radiation protection principles. Today, we're really zeroing in on the practical side.
How we measure the biological impact and those crucial dose limits.
Exactly. How we quantify the effects and, critically, the specific limits we use in Rad Onc. This stuff isn't just theory.
Oh, no, it's everyday practice.
Okay.
And definitely board exam material.
Absolutely key for boards and for safety, right? For us, our staff, patients, everyone.
Couldn't agree more. Last time we hit the big three pillars, remember? Justification, optimization, or ALRRA, and dose limitation.
And we talked about absorbed dose measured in gray, just the energy dumped per unit mass.
Right. Gray tells you the energy, but not necessarily the biological consequence, does it? Because different radiation types, well, they don't cause the same harm per gray.
That's the perfect place to start today, bridging that gap,
Yeah.
between energy and actual biological risk.
So we'll break down equivalent dose, effective dose,
And those super important weighting factors, W sub R for radiation type and W sub T for tissue type.
and then pull it all together with the specific annual dose limits from NCRP, ICRP for occupational exposure, public, pregnant workers.
We got to know these numbers. Understanding why they are what they are is just as important.
It really is. It's about putting risk into perspective.
Okay, so why isn't absorbed dose enough? You mentioned different radiation types. Why is 1 gray of alpha so much nastier than 1 gray of X-rays?
It really boils down to how the energy gets deposited. Think linear energy transfer, LET. Alpha particles are like bowling balls, right?
Yeah.
Heavy charge, they plow through tissue, leaving a dense trail of damage over a short distance.
High LET.
Exactly, high LET. Photons, X-rays, gamma rays, they're more like scattered BB pellets. Sparsely ionizing, they travel further, depositing energy, more spread out.
Lower LET.
Right. And that dense damage from alphas, it's much better at causing complex DNA breaks, things that are hard for the cell to fix, compared to the scattered damage from photons.
Ah, okay. So it's the concentration of damage. Makes sense. And that's where equivalent dose comes in, to sort of normalize the biological effect.
Precisely. Equivalent dose, we use H sub T for a specific tissue T, basically takes the absorbed dose in that tissue from a certain radiation type R, that's D sub TR,
Okay, absorbed dose D sub TR.
and multiplies it by a factor that reflects that radiation's relative biological punch.
And that factor is the radiation weighting factor, W sub R. So the formula is just H sub T equals D sub TR times W sub R.
Yep, HT equals DTR WR. Pretty straightforward.
And the unit for this equivalent dose.
That's the Sievert SV. Remember, that's the SI unit. You might still see the older unit on exams. The REM, Röntgen equivalent man.
Ah, right, REM. Need to know the conversion.
Yeah, 1 Sievert is equal to 100 REM. Good one to keep handy.
So the whole point of H sub T, the equivalent dose, is to estimate the risk of stochastic effects, right? Cancer, heritable stuff. Put it on a common scale no matter the radiation type.
That's the main goal, yes.
Yeah.
Estimating stochastic risk, primarily.
And these W sub R values, they're not just pulled out of thin air.
No. They're based on radiobiological data, things like relative biological effectiveness, RBE, especially looking at low doses and low dose rates relevant for protection. They're recommended by bodies like the ICRP International Commission on Radiological Protection. The ones we use mostly come from their 2007 publication 103, and they're chosen to be conservative, protective.
Got it. So which W sub R values do we absolutely need to have locked down for the boards?
Okay, key ones. For photons, that's X-rays and gamma rays, any energy W sub R is 1.
Simple enough. W sub R equals 1 for photons.
Same for electrons and muons, all energies. W sub R is 1.
Okay, photons, electrons, muons, all 1. Easy start.
Now for protons and charged pions, it steps up. W sub R is 2.
Protons, W sub R equals 2.
And then the heavy hitters, reflecting that dense ionization, that high LET we talked about.
Yeah.
Alpha particles, fission fragments, heavy ions. They get a W sub R of 20.
20. Okay, that's a big jump.
Yeah.
Really shows their biological effectiveness.
It does. Now, neutrons are the tricky ones. Their W sub R actually depends on their energy.
Right, I remember that being complicated.
Yeah, it follows a curve. It's lower for thermal neutrons, maybe around 2.5, then it peaks up around 20 for neutrons around 1 MeV, and then it drops off again at higher energies.
So for board purposes, what do we need to know for neutrons?
Know that it's energy dependent.
Yeah.
Know that 20 is the maximum W sub R around that 1 MeV range. If they just say neutrons without specifying energy, the context might imply a value somewhere between, say, 5 and 20, depending on the assumed energy spectrum.
Yeah.
But 20 is the highest value.
Okay, so 20 is the max for neutrons. just like alphas. Good to remember. Clinical pearl time.
Definitely. If you get a board question with mixed radiation fields, like our worker earlier,
Ah, the alpha and gamma example.
right, you have to apply the W sub R factor to each absorbed dose component before you add them up to get the total equivalent dose. 1 gray of alphas contributes 20 sieverts, while 1 gray of gammas contributes only 1 sievert. That W sub R is critical.
Huge difference. Okay, so equivalent dose accounts for the type of radiation. But what about where it hits the body? You mentioned tissues have different sensitivities.
Exactly. Getting hit with radiation in your bone marrow is generally riskier in terms of long-term cancer development than getting the same equivalent dose just on your skin, right?
Makes intuitive sense. So we need another layer of adjustment.
We do, and that's where effective dose comes in, symbol E. It's designed to give a single value representing the overall risk to the whole body, even if the exposure is non-uniform.
How does it do that?
It takes the equivalent dose calculated for each irradiated organ or tissue, that H sub T we just discussed, and multiplies that by another weighting factor specific to that tissue's sensitivity to stochastic harm.
Ah, the tissue weighting factor, W sub T.
Precisely. So the formula for effective dose, E,
Hmm.
is the sum across all the tissues T that got irradiated of the tissue weighting factor, W sub T, for that tissue multiplied by the equivalent dose, H sub T, that tissue received.
So E equals the sum of W sub T times H sub T for all tissues.
You got it. E equals the sum of WTHT.
And the unit for effective dose is?
Still the sievert, SV. Both equivalent dose and effective dose use sieverts.
Okay. And the power of this effective dose number is comparing overall risk, right? Like, I could compare the risk from a chest x-ray to the risk from swallowing some radioactive iodine using this single number.
That's exactly the idea. It provides a common currency for risk, regardless of how the dose was delivered, whole body, partial body, internal, external, mixed radiation types. It estimates the total detriment.
And these tissue weighting factors, W sub T, where do they come from? Also ICRP?
Yep, also ICRP, same Pub 103 from 2007. They're dimensionless numbers, and crucially, if you sum up the W sub T values for all tissues in the body, they add up to 1.0.
They represent the relative contribution of each organ to the total risk of fatal and non-fatal cancer, plus heritable effects, assuming the whole body was uniformly irradiated.
That's the concept, and knowing the key W sub T values is definitely helpful for boards.
Okay, let's hit the high points. Which tissues have the highest W sub T?
The highest value assigned is 0.12. This goes to a group of pretty sensitive tissues: red bone marrow, colon, lung, stomach, breast, and then a category called remainder tissues.
Right, remainder catches a bunch of others not listed individually: adrenals, kidneys, spleen, pancreas, etc. They collectively get 0.12.
Yep, so that's a top tier. 0.12 each for marrow, colon, lung, stomach, breast, remainder.
What's next?
Next down is 0.08, and that's assigned specifically to the gonads, tests, and ovaries.
Why so high for gonads? Just cancer risk.
It includes cancer risk, but also heavily weighted for the potential for heritable effects passed to future generations. That's why they stand out.
Ah, okay, 0.08 for gonads.
Then we have a group of 0.04 each: bladder, esophagus, liver, and thyroid.
0.04 for bladder, esophagus, liver, thyroid.
Got it. And finally, the least sensitive organs listed have a W sub T of 0.01 each. That's bone surface, brain, salivary glands, and skin.
Only 0.01 for skin. Wow. So even if the equivalent dose in sieverts to the skin the gonads was identical, the contribution to the overall effective dose, the overall risk, would be 8 times higher from the gonad dose because its W sub T is 0.08 compared to skin's 0.01.
Exactly. That's the whole point of W sub T. It weights the dose based on the tissue's contribution to total harm.
Maybe an analogy helps here, like W sub R adjusts for the type of punch. Is it a jab, photon, or a haymaker, alpha? And W sub T adjusts for where that punch lands a hit to the gut. Gonads, W sub T 0.08, is inherently riskier than the same hit to the arm. Skin, W sub T 0.01.
A pretty good analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
Captures the idea well.
And for remembering that big 0.12 group, any tricks?
Well, you could try something like, my colon, lungs, stomach, breasts, and the rest. The first letters don't quite work for marrow, but it gets the main ones plus the remainder category in there. My colon, lungs, stomach, breasts, and the rest all get 0.12.
Okay. My colon, lungs, stomach, breasts, and the rest. I can work with that. So we use W sub R for radiation type, W sub T for tissue sensitivity, multiply them by absorbed dose appropriately, sum it up, and get effective dose in sieverts, our best single measure of overall stochastic risk.
You've got it. And that effective dose is what the main dose limits are based on.
Okay, let's talk limits. These are the lines we don't cross, designed using these concepts.
Right. These limits are really the foundation of radiation safety regulations. Their main goal is twofold. First, prevent those nasty deterministic effects, the ones with a dose threshold like skin burns or cataracts.
Things that will happen if the dose is high enough.
Exactly. And second, keep the probability of stochastic effects cancer, heritable diseases, down to a level considered acceptable. We'll mainly focus on the NCRP recommendations, standard here in the U.S., but I'll mention key ICRP differences since they pop up on boards too.
Sounds good. First up, occupational limits. For us, working with radiation, adults 18 and over.
Okay, the big one. Annual effective dose limit. This relates to the total stochastic risk. The limit is 50 millisieverts, MSV, per year.
50 millisv, or 5 rem, using the old unit.
Yep, 50 millisv or 5 rem per year. That's the same headline number for both NCRP and ICRP's maximum in any single year.
That's our main budget for occupational risk per year. Is there a lifetime limit too?
NCRP sets a cumulative lifetime effective dose limit. It's simply 10 millisv multiplied by your age in years.
So if you're 40, your cumulative limit would be 10 times 40, so 400 millisv total over your working life so far.
Exactly. ICRP takes a slightly different approach for managing the long-term dose, recommending an average of 20 millisv per year over 5-year periods, still with that 50 millisv cap in any 1 year. Both aim to control lifetime risk.
Okay, so 50 millisv annual effective days for stochastic risk. What about deterministic limits for specific organs?
Right. These are equivalent dose limits for specific tissues, set below deterministic thresholds. Annually, for the lens of the eye, NCRP says 50 millisv.
50 millisv per year for the lens.
Yes, but here's a key point of difference often tested. ICRP, based on newer data about cataracts forming at lower doses, lowered their recommendation in Pub 103. They suggest 20 millisv per year averaged over 5 years, with a maximum of 50 millisv in any single year.
Okay, so NCRP is 50, but ICRP is effectively 20 averaged. Need to know both might appear.
Definitely be aware of that ICRP 20 millisv average for the lens. Now, for the skin averaged over the most exposed square centimeter at a depth of 0.07 millimeters, the annual limit is 500 millisv.
500 millisv for skin.
Yeah, 500 millisv or 50 rems. Same limit applies to the hands and feet, the extremities, 500 millisv per year.
Whoa, hold on. 500 millisv for skin and extremities compared to the 50 millisv effective dose limit for the whole body. Why, 10 times higher?
Excellent question. It perfectly highlights the difference in why the limits are set. The 50 millisv effective dose limit is about controlling the probability of stochastic effects like cancer over a lifetime. Skin and extremities have low tissue weighting factors. W sub T equals 0.01 for skin, meaning they contribute very little to that overall stochastic risk.
Oh.
The 500 millisv limit for skin and extremities isn't primarily about cancer risk. It's set well below the dose threshold where you'd start seeing deterministic effects like erythema, redness, desquamation, peeling, or damage to nails, because those tissues can tolerate a much higher dose before showing that kind of direct injury.
Okay, that clicks now. The 500 millisv is preventing guaranteed harm, deterministic, while the 50 millisv is managing long-term probability, stochastic. Different goals, different limits. Makes sense.
Precisely. Now, what about the general public? People not occupationally exposed?
Their limits must be lower, right? They aren't choosing this risk.
Much lower. These limits apply to exposure from man-made sources, importantly excluding natural background radiation and any doses they receive as patients for medical procedures.
Right, so not radon in your basement or your own CT scan.
Exactly. For the public's effective dose, NCRP gives an annual limit of 1 millisv, that's 0.1 rem, per year for situations of continuous or frequent exposure.
1 millisv per year. Compared to 50 millisv for us workers, that's a factor of 50 difference.
Reflect a different level of acceptable risk. NCRP also allows up to 5 millisv, 0.5 rem, in a year for infrequent exposures, but that 1 millisv is the main continuous limit.
And ICRP, is it similar for the public?
ICRP's primary annual public limit is generally stated as 1 millisv as well, maybe without quite the same formal frequent distinction as NCRP puts it.
Okay, 1 millisv public annual effective dose. What about deterministic limits for the public's eyes or skin?
Also lower than occupational. For the lens of the eye, the public annual limit is 15 millisv, 1.5 rem.
15 public versus 50 occupational, NCRP.
And for skin and extremities, the public annual limit is 50 millisv, 5 rem.
50 public versus 500 occupational. Again, much lower. Okay, now a really crucial one for us. Declared pregnant workers.
Absolutely critical. The developing embryo and fetus are particularly sensitive to radiation. So once a worker formally declares her pregnancy,
Special limits kick in?
yes,
Mm.
NCRP recommends limiting the effective dose to the embryo fetus to no more than 0.5 millisv, that's 0.05 rem, in any given month.
0.5 millisv per month. That's tiny compared to the occupational limit.
It is. And furthermore, the total effective dose to the embryo fetus over the entire gestation period should not exceed 5 millisv, 0.5 rem.
So 0.5 millisv per month, A and D, a total cap of 5 millisv for the whole pregnancy. These are vital numbers to remember.
Absolutely vital. ICRP's guidance is very much aligned, recommending the total fetal dose shouldn't exceed about 1 millisv during the remainder of the pregnancy after declaration, essentially aiming for that same very low total dose.
Yeah.
The key message is substantial dose reduction is required once a pregnancy is declared.
Makes sense. Are there specific limits for, say, students or trainees under 18 who might be around radiation sources in an educational setting?
Yes, NCRP addresses this. For education and training exposures for individuals under 18, the limits are basically the same as the continuous public limits. That's 1 millisv per year effective dose.
1 millisv effective dose.
And the deterministic limits are 15 millisv per year for the lens and 50 millisv per year for skin and extremities.
Okay, same as public. Good to know.
Yeah.
Any other limit concepts?
Just one more term you might see is the negligible individual dose, or NID. NCRP suggests this level is 0.01 millar per year. It's considered a trivial level of risk, below regulatory concern.
0.01 millisv. Okay. Wow, that was a lot of numbers and concepts. Gray, sievert, rem, W sub R, W sub T, equivalent dose, effective dose, and all those specific limits.
It is a lot, but it's the framework for everything we do in radiation safety.
So how do these limits actually play out in the clinic or facility?
They drive everything. Shielding designed for LENAC vaults and CT rooms is calculated to ensure doses outside stay below public or occupational limits. Procedures for handling radioactive sources are designed to minimize exposure time and maximize distance, keeping doses array and below limits.
And our dosimeters, the badges we wear.
That's the direct check. Film badges, TLDs, OSLs, they measure the dose we receive, typically equivalent dose at a certain depth. Those readings are tracked against our 50 millisv annual limit.
But our radiation safety officers usually react way before we get close to 50 millisv, right? They have action levels.
Exactly. Action levels are internal triggers set much lower, maybe 10% or 20% of the formal limit. If someone's badge reads above an action level, it prompts an investigation. What happened? Can we change practices? It's about being proactive, ensuring elastary, and preventing anyone from even approaching the regulatory limit.
What about patients? We blast them with doses way above these limits in radiation therapy.
Right. Patients undergoing medical procedures aren't subject to these occupational or public limits. Why? Because there's a direct medical benefit intended from the exposure that justifies the risk.
Justification, pillar number 1.
Precisely. But that doesn't mean dose doesn't matter for patients. Optimization, pillar number 2, is crucial. We always aim to use the lowest dose necessary to achieve the diagnostic or therapeutic goal. In diagnostics, you hear about dose reference levels, DRLs, benchmarks to help optimize protocols.
And in therapy, our entire treatment planning process is about maximizing tumor dose while minimizing dose to normal tissues, respecting their tolerance doses.
Which are essentially based on the thresholds for deterministic effects in those tissues. So, while not the regulatory limits we discussed, the underlying principle of limiting dose to avoid harm is absolutely central to patient treatment.
Got it. And managing pregnant workers, that's a direct application of the fetal limit, right?
Absolutely. When a worker declares pregnancy, the RSO steps in. They'll review her work, maybe do extra monitoring, suggest ways to reduce exposure, more distance, maybe some additional temporary shielding, perhaps even reassignment to lower dose tasks if feasible and necessary. The goal is to actively manage her work environment to ensure that fetal dose stays below 0.5 millisv per month and 5 millisv total, all while respecting her employment rights.
It makes that 0.5 and 5 millisv very real. And these limits affect things outside the clinic, too.
Definitely. Think about nuclear power plants, industrial radiography, their shielding, waste disposal, effluent monitoring. It's all designed and regulated to keep public doses below that 1 millisv annual limit. These principles are everywhere radiation is used.
So these numbers aren't just for exams. They genuinely shape how we handle radiation safely.
They are absolutely foundational. Okay, feeling ready to test some of this. Let's shift gears. Board review blitz time.
Let's do it. Hit me with question 1.
All right. A worker receives an absorbed dose of 0.02 gray from alpha particles, where W sub R is 20, and also 0.05 gray from gamma rays, W sub R equals 1. What's their total equivalent dose? Is it A, 0.07 sieverts, B, 0.25 sieverts. C, 0.45 sieverts. D, 1.02 sieverts.
Okay, got to calculate equivalent dose for each part and add them up. Alpha part, 0.02 gray times W sub R of 20, that's 0.4 sieverts.
Good. And the gamma part?
Gamma part, 0.05 gray times W sub R of 1, that's 0.05 sieverts.
So the total is?
0.4 SV plus 0.05 SV equals 0.45 sieverts. The answer is C.
Perfect. See how much the alpha dose contributes despite being smaller and gray? That W sub R makes all the difference.
Definitely hammers that point home. Okay, next question.
Which of the following tissues has the highest tissue weighting factor? W sub T, based on ICRP 2007, indicating the greatest contribution to overall stochastic risk. A, thyroid. B, skin. C, bone marrow red. D, brain.
Okay, highest W sub T. Thyroid is 0.04. Skin is way down, 0.01. Brain is also 0.01. Red bone marrow, that's in the top group, 0.12.
So the answer is?
C, bone marrow, red. And remembering our mnemonic, my colon, lungs, stomach, breasts, and the rest are all 0.12.
Excellent recall. Question 3. What is the NCRP recommended annual effective dose limit for continuous or frequent exposure for a member of the general public?
Yeah.
A, 0.01 millisVP, 0.5 millisVC, 1 millisVD, 5 millisVE, 50 millisV.
Okay, keywords. Public annual effective dose continuous,
I see.
not
Yeah,
occupational
okay, yeah.
50, not infrequent public 5, not monthly fetal 0.5, or NID 0.01.
That's got to be.
1 millisievert, absolutely essential number to know.
1 MSV public. Got it. Last one for the blitz.
Last one. A radiation worker declares she's pregnant. According to NCRP, what's the recommended effective dose limit to the embryo or fetus for the entire duration of the pregnancy? A, 0.5 millisV, 1 millisV, 5 millisVD, 50 millisVD. Okay, careful reading. Asks for the limit for the entire duration, not the monthly limit. The monthly is 0.5 millisV.
But the total for the gestation is?
0.5 millisieverts. Answer C. Easy trap to fall into if you don't read closely.
Very easy. So some quick tips for studying this stuff for boards. Really grasp the concepts first. Why gray versus sievert? Why equivalent versus effective dose? Understand the purpose of W sub R and W sub T. Once the concepts make sense, memorizing the key numbers becomes easier.
Like W sub R values 1 to 20. Key W sub T groups 0.12, 0.08, 0.04, 0.01.
Exactly. And the main limits, 50 millisV occupational annual effective, 1 millisV public annual effective continuous, 0.5 millisV monthly, 5 millisV total fetal. And don't forget those deterministic limits, especially the 50 millisV NCRP, 20 millisV ICRP average for the occupational lens, and the 500 millisV for occupational sky and extremities. Always watch the units MSV versus SV, and the time frame annual, monthly, total, lifetime.
Breaking it down like that helps. It seems daunting, but it's manageable if you tackle it systematically. And yeah, these aren't just abstract numbers. We think about these principles daily.
You do, and you absolutely can master this for the boards. It's core knowledge for being a safe and competent radiation oncologist. Keep reviewing, keep quizzing yourself, maybe use flashcards for the numbers. It'll stick. You've got this.
Okay, deep breath. We've covered a lot of ground today. Units, weighting factors, the whole system of dose limits. Really laid the groundwork for understanding radiation risk quantitatively.
We really did. And having established this framework of limits and units, next time we can shift focus a bit. We'll look at the actual laboratory tools, the molecular techniques we use to investigate how radiation affects things at the DNA and protein level.
So moving from the how much and what limit to the how does it actually cause damage at a molecular level, like PCR and stuff.
Exactly like PCR. We'll talk about PCR, southern blots for DNA, northern for RNA, western for proteins.
Yeah.
What they are, how they work, what they tell us about radiation effects.
Okay, what else?
We'll touch on DNA sequencing, the classic Sanger method, and the newer next-generation sequencing approaches. And importantly, assays specifically designed to detect DNA damage after radiation, things like the COMET assay, looking for DNA breaks, or staining for gamma H2AX foci, which mark double-strand breaks. Maybe also chip assays, and even CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing and its role in radiobiology research.
Yeah, okay, so really getting into the nuts and bolts of the research methods used to understand mechanisms, that sounds super relevant for interpreting studies and understanding the biology deeper.
That's the plan. It connects the biological effects we talk about to the actual experiments scientists perform.
Perfect. So, quick recap of today's absolute must-knows. Equivalent dose, H sub T, uses the radiation weighting factor, W sub R, to account for radiation typals. Remember, W sub R is 1 for photons electrons, 2 for protons, and 20 for alpha neutrons, max.
And effective dose E uses tissue weighting factors, W sub T, to account for organ sensitivity, giving an overall risk estimate. Remember, high W sub T for marrow, colon, lung, stomach, breast, all 0.12, gonads, 0.08, and low W sub T for skin, brain, 0.01, sum of W sub T is 1.
And the key NCRP limits, occupational annual effective dose equals 50 millisV. Public annual effective dose, continuous 1 millisV. Declared pregnant worker equals 0.5 millisV per month, 5 millisV total to the fetus.
Don't forget the high occupational deterministic limits. 50 millisV annual for lens, know the ICRP 20 millisV average too, and 500 millisV annual for scan extremities. Set high to prevent tissue damage.
Got it. Mastering these is just fundamental. It's not just about the boards, it's about our daily practice and keeping everyone safe. Keep hitting these concepts hard, they're that important.
Absolutely. For more practice, including oral board scenarios, check out radoncsmartlearn.com. And join us next time as we dive into those molecular techniques. Seriously, keep up the great work with your Rad Bio prep. You are building a crucial foundation.